Billionaire found his housekeeper sleeping on park benches in winter. What he did next was unbelievable. There, wrapped in newspapers on a park bench in the middle of a Chicago blizzard, was his former housekeeper, the woman whose life he destroyed to save a business deal. "You promised me, Will. You said I could trust you." Those were the last words she'd spoken to him 6 months ago before vanishing from his life. Now, as he stared at her shivering on a frozen park bench, homeless and broken, he realized his choice to protect her had actually destroyed her. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue to 3 weeks earlier. The wind howling through Chicago's Lincoln Park carried the promise of the season's first real snowstorm. Maggie O'Connor pulled her thin gray cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she arranged her few belongings on the wooden bench. At 34, her auburn hair had lost its shine, and her green eyes, once bright with laughter, now held the wary look of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Her fingers, cracked from the cold, fumbled with the zipper of a worn black duffel bag. Inside were the remnants of her former life: a faded photograph of her late mother, a small silver locket, and 3 letters she couldn't bring herself to throw away. The bench had become her bedroom for the past 2 months, ever since the shelter reached capacity and the waiting lists grew too long. "Another night," she whispered to herself, the words forming small white puffs in the frigid air. Her stomach growled. She'd had nothing but a stale donut from behind the bakery on Wells Street that morning. But pride, stubborn and familiar, kept her from the soup kitchen. She'd rather go hungry than face the pitying looks. The streetlights flickered on as evening settled over the city. Families hurried past bundled in warm coats, heading home to heated apartments and dinner tables. Maggie pulled a thin blanket around her legs and tried to ignore the way the metal bench seemed to steal every bit of warmth from her body. How did I get here? The question haunted her every night. 6 months ago, she'd had a steady job, a small but comfortable apartment in Wicker Park, and something that felt dangerously close to love. Now she had nothing but memories that cut deeper than the winter wind. 27 floors above the city, Will Hartwell stood in his office overlooking Lake Michigan, his reflection ghosted in the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 41, he commanded boardrooms with the same intensity his steel-gray eyes held now. His dark hair, touched with silver at the temples, was perfectly styled even at 9 p.m. The charcoal suit that hugged his tall frame cost more than most people made in a month. But tonight, success felt hollow. "Mr. Hartwell?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The car is waiting downstairs." "Cancel it," Will said without turning from the window. "I'll walk." "Walk." "Sir, it's below freezing." "I said cancel it." The silence that followed was familiar. His staff had learned not to question his decisions, no matter how erratic they seemed. Will pulled on his black wool overcoat and headed for the elevator, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floors. The streets of downtown Chicago buzzed with holiday shoppers and theatergoers, but Will moved through them like a ghost. His mind was elsewhere, replaying a conversation from 6 months ago that had changed everything. Her voice, thick with hurt and disbelief, still echoed in his quiet moments. "You promised me, Will. You said I could trust you." He'd made a choice that night. Business over heart, reputation over love. The merger had gone through. His company's value had doubled. But the cost. The wind picked up as he turned onto Lakeshore Drive, and he found himself walking toward Lincoln Park without conscious decision. His feet carried him along familiar paths where he used to jog on weekend mornings, past the zoo, past the conservatory, toward the cluster of benches where he sometimes sat to think. A movement in the shadows caught his attention. Someone was huddled on his usual bench, a small figure wrapped in what looked like newspaper and a threadbare blanket. Homeless, obviously. Chicago's winter was particularly brutal this year, and the sight of people sleeping rough always stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He should keep walking. He had a conference call with Tokyo in an hour. But something made him slow his steps, made him look closer at the person curled against the bitter cold. Red hair spilled from beneath a knit cap. A familiar slope of shoulders, the way she held herself even in sleep, protective, guarded. His breath caught. Maggie! The figure stirred, lifting her head slowly. When their eyes met across the space between them, Will felt the world tilt on its axis. Margaret O'Connor, the woman who had cleaned his home for 3 years, who had listened to his late-night worries about business deals and family expectations, who had somehow become the most important person in his carefully ordered life, stared back at him with a mixture of shock, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to shame. Will! His name fell from her lips like a prayer and a curse combined. They looked at each other across the 6 feet of frozen ground that might as well have been an ocean. He in his expensive coat and polished shoes, she wrapped in newspapers and defeat. The contrast was stark, painful, impossible to ignore. "What are you doing here?" The question escaped him before he could stop it, and he immediately regretted how it sounded, like an accusation rather than concern. Maggie's chin lifted in that stubborn way he remembered so well. "Same thing you are, I imagine. Trying to stay warm." But they both knew that wasn't true. He could go home to his heated penthouse any time he chose. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. The wind picked up again, sending a newspaper skittering across the path between them. In its wake came the first few snowflakes of the season, dancing in the amber glow of the streetlights. "Maggie, Will started forward, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't." Her voice was steady, but he could see her shivering. "Just don't." They stood frozen in more than just the December cold, 2 people whose lives had intersected in ways that changed everything, now facing each other across a chasm of hurt, pride, and unspoken regret. The snow began to fall harder, and in the distance, thunder rumbled, unusual for a snowstorm, but somehow fitting for a night when the impossible was about to become inevitable. The snow fell harder now, each flake catching the amber streetlight like tiny stars before melting against Maggie's cheek. She could feel Will's eyes on her, studying her face with that intense focus she remembered too well. The same look he'd given her when she'd first walked into his Kenwood mansion 3 years ago, nervous and trying not to gawk at the marble foyer. "How long?" His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual commanding tone. "How long what?" But she knew what he was asking. "How long have you been?" He gestured helplessly at the bench, at her newspaper blanket, at the shopping cart nearby that held everything she owned. 2 months. The admission tasted bitter. Maybe 3. Time gets fuzzy when you're counting meals instead of days. Will's jaw tightened. She watched him process this information, watched his businessman's mind calculating backwards. 2 months ago was October. October was when the first frost hit Chicago. October was when she'd lost her apartment because she couldn't make rent after losing her job at the cleaning service. The job she'd lost because of him. Jesus, Maggie. He took a step closer, and she could smell his cologne, that expensive sandalwood scent that used to comfort her when she'd find him working late in his study. "Why didn't you call you?" Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "Really? After what happened?" The words hung between them like a blade. Will's face went very still, that mask of control sliding into place that she'd seen him use in business meetings. But his eyes, those gray eyes that had once looked at her like she was the only person in the world, they couldn't hide the guilt. A gust of wind sent her newspaper blanket skittering across the frozen ground. Without thinking, Will lunged forward to catch it, his expensive leather gloves closing around the cheap newsprint. When he straightened and held it out to her, their fingers brushed. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to remember how those hands had once cupped her face with infinite tenderness. Enough for him to feel how cold she was, how the chill had settled into her bones. "You're freezing." It wasn't a question. "I'm fine." "You're turning blue." "I said I'm fine." But even as she spoke, another violent shiver ran through her. Her teeth chattered, and she clenched her jaw to stop it. Will pulled off his coat in one smooth motion. The black wool garment probably cost more than she used to make in 2 months. Here. No. She pushed his hands away, but her strength was nothing compared to his. I don't want your charity. It's not charity. It's… what? Guilt. The words exploded from her, months of pain and anger finally finding their voice. Is that what this is, Will? You feeling bad about destroying my life, so now you want to play hero? I never meant for… For what? For me to get fired? For my references to be worthless because everyone in this city knows exactly what kind of services your housekeepers provide. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated herself for it. Hated that even now, even after everything, he could still make her feel small. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. She watched his face go pale, watched him step back as if she'd slapped him. You think I… God, Maggie, you think I would do that to you? What else was I supposed to think? The words poured out now, a dam bursting after months of silence. One day we're whatever we were, and the next day your lawyers are calling it a professional misconduct issue and threatening lawsuits if I ever mention your name. One day you're telling me you low… She stopped herself, but the unfinished word hung in the air between them. Love. He'd almost said he loved her that last night in May, when the spring rain had been falling against his bedroom windows and she'd been curled against his chest, tracing patterns on his skin. Almost said it, but then his phone had rung. Another crisis, another deal, another reason to choose business over everything else. The Brennan merger, he said quietly, understanding flooding his voice. You think I threw you away to protect the deal? She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. Will ran a hand through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. Snow caught in the dark strands, making him look younger, more vulnerable. Maggie, that's not… It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? She stood up from the bench, her legs unsteady from cold and exhaustion. Even standing, she barely reached his shoulder, but anger gave her height. Explain it to me, then. Explain why your head of security called me into that room. Explain why they had photographs, Will. Pictures of us together that they said could damage your reputation if they got out. The photographs. Will closed his eyes, remembering. Someone, he'd never found out who, had taken pictures of them together. Nothing explicit, nothing inappropriate, just intimate. Maggie laughing at something he'd whispered at a charity gala. His hand on the small of her back as they walked through Millennium Park. The way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. But in the hands of his competitors, those images could have been twisted into something ugly. The billionaire and his housekeeper. The scandal that could have tanked the Brennan merger, cost him everything he'd worked for. So he'd made a choice. The same choice he always made. I was protecting you, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. By having me fired? By making sure I couldn't get another job in this city? By pretending I never existed? Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. Some protection. The snow was falling heavier now, coating the bench, the ground, her hair. In the distance, thunder rumbled again. A rare thunder snow, the meteorologists called it. Dangerous and beautiful and impossible to predict. Will took a step toward her, then stopped. I know you won't believe this, but I never meant for you to lose your job. That was never supposed to happen. But it did happen. She turned back to him, and he could see tears freezing at the corners of her eyes. And you let it happen. You could have stopped it with one phone call, Will. One word from you, and I'd still have my apartment. I'd still have my life. I know. The admission was barely audible. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry, Maggie. She stared at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read the truth there. The wind whipped around them, sending snow spiraling in small tornadoes across the park. Somewhere in the distance, A church bell chimed midnight. "Sorry doesn't keep me warm," she said finally. "Sorry doesn't put food in my stomach or a roof over my head. Sorry is just another word rich people use when they feel bad about the lives they've destroyed." The cruelty of it was precise, surgical. Will felt it cut deep, felt the truth of it settle in his chest like ice. She was right. Sorry was a luxury he could afford, and she couldn't. But as he watched her gather her meager belongings, watched her prepare to disappear back into the night and the cold, he realized something that terrified him more than any business deal, any merger, any risk he'd ever taken. He couldn't let her go. Not again. Not like this. "Come home with me." The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and desperate. Maggie froze, her hands still clutching the handle of her shopping cart. "What?" "Come home with me," he repeated, stepping closer. "It's too cold. This storm is getting worse. You'll freeze to death out here." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So now you want to save me? Where was this noble streak 6 months ago?" Will opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a crack of thunder split the night sky, followed immediately by a flash of lightning that turned the snow into silver daggers. The storm was getting dangerous, and they both knew it. In that moment of electric silence that followed, two broken people stood in the falling snow, their past spreading between them like a chasm and their future hanging on the next word spoken. The lightning had barely faded when Maggie shook her head, backing away from Will's outstretched hand like it might burn her. "No, absolutely not. Maggie, be reasonable. Reasonable." She spun around, her green eyes flashing with something dangerous. "You want to talk about reasonable? What's reasonable is you walking away and pretending you never saw me. What's reasonable is me figuring out my own problems like I have been for the past 6 months." Another crack of thunder rolled across Lincoln Park, closer this time. The snow was coming down in thick sheets now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Will could see his breath forming clouds as he spoke, could see how Maggie's lips were turning blue despite her stubborn refusal to acknowledge the cold. "This isn't about pride anymore," he said, his voice taking on the edge he used in boardrooms when negotiations weren't going his way. "This is about survival. You could die out here tonight. People die every day." She yanked the shopping cart closer to her, the wheels catching in the accumulating snow. "Rich people just don't usually have to watch it happen." The accusation stung because it was true. How many homeless people had he walked past in his 41 years? How many times had he averted his eyes, told himself it wasn't his problem, donated money to charities so he could sleep better at night without actually having to confront the reality of suffering? But this was different. This was Maggie. "I can't leave you here," he said simply. "You don't get to decide that." Her voice was getting hoarse from the cold, but her spine remained straight. "You gave up the right to decide anything about my life when you chose your precious merger over." She stopped herself again, just like she had before. "Over me," Will finished silently. "Over us." A gust of wind nearly knocked Maggie off her feet. She stumbled, and instinctively Will reached out to steady her. For just a moment, she let him. For just a moment, she leaned into his strength, and he felt the tremors running through her small frame. Then she pulled away as if his touch had electrocuted her. "I don't need your help," she said, but her voice wavered. "Yes, you do." Will pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up his face in the darkness. "I'm calling you a car. You can go to a hotel, get warm, get some food." "With what money?" The question cut through his solution like a knife through silk. "You think I'm out here by choice? You think I enjoy sleeping on benches and digging through dumpsters for dinner? If I had money for a hotel, Will, I wouldn't be homeless." The simple logic of it hit him like a brick wall. Of course. She had no money, no credit cards, no resources. The gulf between their worlds had never felt wider than it did in that moment, with him standing there in his $1,000 coat trying to solve her problems with solutions that required the very thing she lacked. "Then I'll pay for it," he said. "No. Maggie." I said no. She was shivering violently now, her whole body shaking with cold, but her voice remained firm. I won't be your charity case. I won't be the homeless woman you rescued to make yourself feel better about what you did. That's not what this is about. Isn't it? She took a step closer to him, and even in the dim streetlight he could see the fire in her eyes. Tell me, Will, when you saw me sitting on that bench, what was your first feeling? Relief that you could finally do something to assuage your guilt? Excitement that you'd found a way to be the hero instead of the villain? The accuracy of her words was like a physical blow. Because yes, there had been relief. Relief that he could finally act, finally do something to fix the disaster he'd created. But there had been something else too, something deeper and more complicated that he wasn't ready to examine. You're being stubborn, he said instead. I'm being smart. She turned away from him, starting to push her cart toward the park's exit. This is what happens, Will. This is what your world does to people like me. We get close, we start to matter, and then we get discarded when it's convenient. I won't make that mistake again. Where will you go? The question escaped him as he watched her prepare to leave. That's not your concern anymore. But even as she said it, they both knew her options were limited. The shelters were full. The warming centers closed at dawn. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and the wind chill was already dropping below zero. Will fell into step beside her as she pushed the cart along the snow-covered path. At least let me call someone. A shelter, You think I haven't tried? She didn't look at him, just kept walking. You think I've been out here for 2 months because I like the fresh air? Every shelter in the city has a waiting list. Every warming center is packed. Every resource is stretched beyond capacity. The shopping cart hit a patch of ice and nearly overturned. Will reached out automatically to help steady it, his hands covering hers on the handle. The contact sent electricity up his arms, the same spark he'd felt the first time he'd accidentally brushed against her while she was dusting his bookshelves 3 years ago. She felt it too. He could see it in the way her breath caught, in the way her green eyes widened slightly before she pulled her hands away. Don't, she whispered. Maggie! Don't touch me. Don't look at me like that. Don't pretend that any of this matters to you beyond your own conscience. They had reached the edge of the park now, where Lake Shore Drive stretched out before them, slick with snow and nearly empty of traffic. The few cars that passed sent sprays of slush across the sidewalk. You're wrong, Will said quietly. About why this matters to me. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Snow had gathered in her red hair, and her lips were nearly colorless from the cold. Then tell me why. Tell me why the great William Hartwell is standing in a blizzard arguing with his former housekeeper instead of going home to his heated mansion. The question hung between them like a challenge. Will opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. How could he explain that seeing her on that bench had shattered something inside him? How could he tell her that for 6 months he'd tried to convince himself he'd made the right choice, but seeing her like this, broken, alone, suffering because of his decisions, had destroyed every justification he'd built? How could he admit that he'd been looking for her? That he'd driven past her old apartment building a dozen times, hoping to catch a glimpse of her? That he'd called the cleaning service she'd worked for, only to be told she was no longer employed there and they couldn't provide her contact information? I can't, he said finally. Can't or won't. Does it matter? She studied his face for a long moment, and he felt exposed under her gaze. Finally, she shook her head. No, I suppose it doesn't. She started walking again, but this time Will didn't follow. He stood at the edge of Lincoln Park and watched her push her cart down the empty sidewalk, her small figure quickly disappearing into the swirling snow. His phone buzzed with a text message. His driver, asking if he needed pickup. His assistant, reminding him about the morning conference call. His world, pulling him back to warmth and safety and the carefully controlled environment where he made decisions that affected millions of dollars but never had to see their human cost. He could go home. He could pretend this never happened. He could return to his life and let Maggie disappear back into the city's invisible population of people who didn't matter to anyone who mattered. But as he watched her figure fade into the storm, Will realized he had a choice to make. The same choice he'd made 6 months ago, just in reverse. What do you think Will should do? Should he respect Maggie's wishes and let her go, or fight for a chance to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Business or heart? Safety or risk? The familiar or the transformative? This time, as the thunder rolled overhead and the snow turned the world white and clean, Will Hartwell made a different choice. He followed her into the storm. Will caught up to Maggie 3 blocks from the park, just as she collapsed. One moment she was pushing the shopping cart through the deepening snow, her shoulders hunched against the wind, and the next she was on her knees on the sidewalk, gasping for breath that came out in sharp white puffs. Maggie! He was beside her in seconds, his hands on her shoulders. Her skin felt like ice through the thin fabric of her cardigan. "I'm fine," she managed between chattering teeth, but they both knew it was a lie. Her lips had gone from blue to gray, and when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. "You're hypothermic." Will's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. "We need to get you warm. Now." "I said I'm fine." But even as she protested, she swayed dangerously. The snow was falling so heavily now that the streetlights looked like pale ghosts in the white. The storm had emptied the streets completely. No cars, no pedestrians, no help coming from any direction. Will pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. The storm was interfering with the cell towers, and his screen showed no signal bars. "My car," Maggie mumbled, her words slurring slightly. "Can't leave my things." Will looked at the shopping cart with its collection of worldly possessions, then at Maggie, who was now shivering so violently she could barely speak. The choice wasn't difficult. "We'll come back for it," he lied, knowing full well that by morning the cart and everything in it would be buried under 2 feet of snow or stolen. But right now, getting her to safety was the only thing that mattered. "No," she tried to protest, but Will was already lifting her from the sidewalk. She weighed almost nothing, and the realization of how much weight she'd lost hit him like a physical blow. "Put me down," she whispered, but there was no fight left in her voice. "Not happening." He carried her toward the nearest building, a 24-hour laundromat that glowed like a beacon through the storm. The owner, an elderly Korean man, looked up in surprise as Will pushed through the door carrying a half-frozen woman. "Please," Will said. "She needs warmth." The man took one look at Maggie's condition and immediately gestured toward the back of the laundromat, where several industrial dryers were running. "Bring her here. The heat is better." Will set Maggie down gently on a plastic chair near the warm machines. The sudden change from bitter cold to blessed heat made her gasp, and for a terrifying moment her eyes rolled back in her head. "Stay with me," Will said, kneeling in front of her and taking her hands in his. Her fingers were so cold they felt like ice cubes. "Maggie, stay with me." The laundromat owner appeared with a stack of warm towels fresh from the dryer. "From the machines," he explained. "Very warm." Will wrapped the towels around Maggie's shoulders, around her hands, trying to get warmth back into her system. Slowly, very slowly, color began to return to her lips. "Better?" Will asked. She nodded weakly, then seemed to remember where they were and how they'd gotten there. "You carried me. You collapsed. I would have been fine. You would have been dead." The words came out harsher than he intended, but the fear he'd felt seeing her crumple to the sidewalk was still raw in his chest. They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the hum of the washing machines and the howl of wind outside. The laundromat owner had tactfully retreated to the front counter, giving them privacy while keeping a watchful eye on Maggie's condition. "Why did you follow me?" she asked finally. Will was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Because I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you. You seemed to manage just fine for 6 months." The accusation hung between them like smoke. Will felt it settle in his chest, adding to the weight of guilt he'd been carrying since that night in May when everything had gone wrong. "I wasn't fine," he said quietly. "I haven't been fine since the day you walked out of my house." Maggie pulled one of the warm towels tighter around her shoulders. The heat from the dryers was slowly chasing away the deadly cold, but she still felt fragile, breakable. "You made your choice. I made the wrong choice." "Yes, you did." There was no anger in her voice now, just exhaustion. "But that doesn't change anything. That doesn't fix anything." Outside, the storm was getting worse. Through the laundromat's front windows, they could see snow swirling in thick clouds, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The few streetlights that were still working looked like distant stars in a white universe. "Storm's getting bad," the laundromat owner called from the front. "Roads are closed. Nothing moving out there tonight." Will felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If the roads were closed, if nothing was moving, then they were stuck here. Together. For the entire night. Maggie seemed to realize the same thing. How long do storms like this usually last? In Chicago? The owner shrugged. Could be hours. Could be until morning. This one looks like it's settling in for a while. Will watched Maggie process this information. Her green eyes, clearer now that warmth was returning to her system, moved from the windows to him to the small space of the laundromat. "I can't," she said quietly. "Can't what?" "Be trapped here with you all night. I can't do this, Will. I can't sit here and pretend that everything is normal, that we're just two people waiting out a storm. What else are we going to do?" His voice was gentle, but there was an undertone of something else. Relief, maybe, that circumstances had forced them together when neither of them had been willing to choose it. "I don't know." She stood up abruptly, the warm towels falling to the floor. "I need air." "Maggie, you can't go back out there. The storm." "I know about the storm." She moved toward the front of the laundromat, toward the windows that showed nothing but white chaos beyond. "But I can't be here with you. I can't sit here and listen to you apologize and make excuses and try to fix things that can't be fixed." Will followed her, keeping his distance but staying close enough to catch her if she collapsed again. "So what do you want me to do? Leave? Walk out into a blizzard and freeze to death just to make you comfortable?" She turned to face him, and he was struck by how small she looked in the fluorescent lighting of the laundromat. Small and fierce and broken in ways that had nothing to do with her physical condition. "I want you to tell me the truth," she said. "Not the sanitized version. Not the business justification. The real truth about what happened that night." The request hit Will like a physical blow. The truth. The whole truth about May 15th, about the photographs, about the choice he'd made and why he'd made it. The truth he'd been running from for 6 months. "Maggie!" "No." She held up a hand to stop him. "If we're stuck here together, if I have to spend the next 8 hours in the same room as you, then I deserve to know. I deserve to understand why my life got destroyed so your business deal could go through." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and the snow continued to fall. Inside the warm cocoon of the laundromat, two people who had once meant everything to each other stood facing a reckoning that was 6 months overdue. The truth was coming, whether Will was ready for it or not. Will stared at Maggie for a long moment, his reflection ghosted in the laundromat window behind her. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look older, more worn than his 41 years. "You want the truth?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "The whole truth. I think I've earned it." He nodded slowly, then walked to one of the plastic chairs and sat down heavily. His expensive suit looked out of place in the utilitarian space, but his posture spoke of a man carrying weight that had nothing to do with business or money. "It started 3 weeks before the merger was supposed to close," he began. "Someone sent photographs to Thomas Brennan's office." Maggie felt her stomach drop. She remembered the photographs his security team had shown her, Will helping her out of his car at a charity gala. his hand on her back as they walked through the Art Institute. The way he'd looked at her when she'd worn that blue dress he'd bought her for the symphony. What kind of photographs? Nothing explicit. Nothing that showed us doing anything inappropriate. Just. Will ran his hands through his hair. Just us together. Looking like we cared about each other. We did care about each other. Yes. The admission seemed to cost him something. We did. And apparently, someone noticed. Maggie sank into the chair across from him. Who sent them? I never found out. Could have been anyone. A competitor trying to sabotage the deal. A tabloid journalist looking for a story. Someone at one of the events we attended together. Will's hands clenched into fists on his knees. The letter that came with them said they had video footage too. Us at my house. Us in my bedroom. The blood drained from Maggie's face. Video footage? I don't know if it was real. I never saw it. But the threat was clear. If the merger went through, if I became CEO of the combined companies, they would release everything. Frame it as a story about the billionaire who was sleeping with his housekeeper. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling sick. She could imagine the headlines, the way the story would be twisted, the way she would be portrayed as a gold digger, a woman who seduced her employer for money and status. So you chose to protect yourself, she said quietly. No. Will's voice was sharp. No, Maggie, that's not what happened. She opened her eyes to find him staring at her with an intensity that made her chest tight. Then what did happen? I chose to protect you. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maggie felt a laugh bubble up in her throat, bitter and disbelieving. Protect me? By having me fired? By destroying my reputation? By making sure I couldn't get another job in this city? By making sure you weren't destroyed in the media circus that would have followed? Will leaned forward, his gray eyes never leaving her face. Do you have any idea what they would have done to you? The reporters, the photographers, the gossip columnists? They would have dug into every aspect of your life. Your childhood, your mother's death, your financial situation. They would have followed you everywhere, camping outside your apartment, harassing your friends. Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. You don't know that. I do know that. I've seen it happen before. When powerful men are caught in compromising situations, the women in their lives become targets. They get painted as manipulative, scheming, opportunistic. Their lives get dissected and analyzed and judged by millions of strangers. He stood up abruptly, beginning to pace the small space between the washing machines. You think losing your job was bad? Try having your face on the cover of every tabloid in the country. Try having reporters following you to the grocery store, to your doctor's appointments, to your mother's grave. Try having your entire existence reduced to a punchline in late-night comedy shows. Maggie watched him pace, her mind reeling. So you made the decision for me. You decided what I could and couldn't handle. I was trying to spare you from something that would have been 1,000 times worse than losing a job. But you didn't tell me. Her voice was getting louder now, the hurt and anger she'd buried for 6 months finally finding their voice. You didn't give me a choice. You just had your lawyers call me in and threaten me with lawsuits if I ever mentioned your name. Will stopped pacing and turned to face her. Because I knew you'd try to fight it. I knew you'd want to stand by me, to weather the storm together. And I couldn't let you do that to yourself. That wasn't your decision to make. Yes, it was. The words exploded from him with a force that made the laundromat owner look up from his magazine. Will lowered his voice, but the intensity remained. It was my decision because I'm the one who put you in that position. I'm the one who let our relationship develop past professional boundaries. I'm the one who brought you into my world knowing how dangerous it could be for you. Maggie stared at him, her heart pounding. Our relationship. Is that what you're calling it now? Will went very still. What else would you call it? I don't know. You never gave it a name. We never talked about what we were to each other. We just... She gestured helplessly. We just existed in this strange space between employer and employee, between friends and lovers. And then one day you decided it was too risky and you threw me away. I didn't throw you away. Yes, you did. Tears were threatening now, but she refused to let them fall. You made a calculation, Will. My life versus your business empire. And you chose the empire. I chose you. The words came out raw, desperate. I chose to sacrifice everything I'd worked for to keep you safe. Do you think walking away from you was easy? Do you think it didn't cost me anything? Maggie felt the world tilt around her. What are you talking about? Will sank back into his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. The merger fell through anyway. Brennan got cold feet about the whole thing. Decided he didn't want to be in business with someone who had moral flexibility issues, as he put it. I lost the deal, lost the expansion opportunity, lost everything I'd been working toward for 2 years. But you said the merger went through. You said your company's value doubled. I lied. Will's voice was barely audible over the hum of the washing machines. I've been lying about a lot of things for the past 6 months. Trying to convince myself that I made the right choice, that sacrificing what we had was worth something. The laundromat felt suddenly too small, too warm. Maggie struggled to process what he was telling her. So you lost me and the merger? Yes. And you've spent 6 months pretending everything was fine? Yes. She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the laundromat, the only sound was the steady tumble of clothes in the dryers. Why didn't you come find me? She asked finally. If you lost everything anyway, why didn't you try to explain? Will's laugh was hollow. By the time I realized what a mistake I'd made, you were gone. Your apartment was empty. The cleaning service said you'd been let go for performance issues and they couldn't give me your contact information. It was like you'd vanished. I didn't vanish. I was right here in Chicago the whole time. I know that now. He looked at her, and she could see the regret written in every line of his face. I drove past your old apartment building dozens of times, hoping to see you. I called shelters, hospitals, anywhere I could think of. But Chicago is a big city, and homeless people are invisible to most of the world. The weight of his words settled between them. 6 months of mutual suffering, of pride and fear and stubborn silence. 6 months of him looking for her while she convinced herself he didn't care. So what now? Maggie asked, her voice small in the fluorescent-lit space. Will met her eyes across the narrow distance between their chairs. I don't know. I honestly don't know. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and dawn was still hours away. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Maggie pulled one of the warm towels tighter around her shoulders, the heat from the dryers finally chasing away the last of the deadly cold that had settled in her bones. I need to understand something, she said quietly. If you were trying to protect me, why did your security team make it sound like I was some kind of threat? Like I was blackmailing you or something? Will winced. That wasn't supposed to happen. I told them to handle your departure quietly, professionally. I never authorized them to threaten you or imply that you'd done anything wrong. But they did. Yes. And when I found out, I fired the head of security. Will's jaw tightened. Not that it helped you any. The damage was already done. Maggie studied his face in the harsh fluorescent light. She'd gotten good at reading people over the past 6 months. Living on the streets taught you to recognize truth from lies, genuine concern from manipulation. What she saw in Will's expression now was raw honesty, the kind that came with real pain. The cleaning service told me you'd specifically requested that I be blacklisted from their client roster, she said. That's not true. Will's voice was firm. I never spoke to anyone at the cleaning service. If they blacklisted you, it was their own decision. Probably thought it would protect their other clients from whatever scandal they imagined was brewing. The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. For 6 months, she'd carried the certainty that Will had systematically destroyed her life out of cold calculation. Learning that some of her suffering had been caused by other people's assumptions and fears, rather than his direct actions, shifted something fundamental in her understanding of what had happened. I spent so many nights hating you, she whispered. You had every right to hate me. Did I? She turned to look at him fully. If what you're telling me is true, if you really were trying to protect me, then maybe I was hating you for the wrong reasons. Will shook his head. You were hating me for the right reasons. I made choices that hurt you, regardless of my intentions. I took away your agency, your ability to make your own decisions about your own life. That's not protection, Maggie. That's control. The admission surprised her. She'd expected him to defend his actions, to insist that he'd been noble and self-sacrificing. Instead, he was acknowledging the fundamental flaw in his reasoning. Why are you saying that? Because I've had 6 months to think about it. 6 months to realize that I was so focused on shielding you from potential consequences that I never stopped to consider what the actual consequences of my protection would be. Will ran his hands through his hair again, a gesture she remembered from late nights when he'd been wrestling with difficult business decisions. I was arrogant enough to think I knew what was best for you. Maggie felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anger and hurt that had been pulled tight for months. It didn't disappear entirely, but it shifted, creating space for something else to grow. Tell me about the last 6 months, she said. What was it really like for you? Will was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the swirling snow beyond the windows. Empty, he said finally. Everything felt empty. The house, the office, my entire life. I kept expecting to hear you humming in the kitchen or find you reading in the library. I kept buying groceries for 2 people out of habit. You kept my room exactly the same for 3 months, he continued, his voice barely audible. I'd walk past it sometimes and convince myself I could still smell your shampoo on the pillow. The image of him wandering through his empty house, looking for traces of her presence, made Maggie's throat tight. Will. I know it doesn't change anything. I know my loneliness doesn't compare to what you've been going through. But you asked for the truth, and the truth is that losing you felt like losing the best part of myself. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The laundromat owner had dozed off at the front counter, his head pillowed on his arms. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the city, but inside their small bubble of warmth and fluorescent light, something was shifting between them. I used to dream about you, Maggie said suddenly. The first few weeks after I lost my apartment, when I was staying in shelters, I dreamed that you came to find me. That you'd realized you'd made a mistake and you wanted to make it right. What happened in the dreams? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Different things. Sometimes you'd just hold me and tell me you were sorry. Sometimes we'd talk all night, like we used to when you couldn't sleep, and I'd make you tea and sit with you in your study. Will remembered those nights. Some of his favorite memories from the past 3 years involved the 2 of them in his study at 2 in the morning, her curled up in the leather chair by the fireplace while he worked, the comfortable silence broken only by occasional conversation about books or music or the random thoughts that surface in the quiet hours. I miss those talks, he said. So do I. What else happened in the dreams? Maggie's cheeks colored slightly. Sometimes we'd go back to the Art Institute. You'd show me the Monet exhibit again, and we'd stand in front of the water lilies painting for an hour, just looking. You loved that painting. I'd never seen anything so beautiful. All those blues and purples swirling together like they were alive. She pulled the towel closer around her shoulders. I went back there once, about a month ago. Snuck in behind a tour group and found that painting. But it didn't look the same without you there explaining the brushwork and the way the light changes depending on where you stand. The admission was so tender, so vulnerable, that Will felt his chest constrict. Maggie! I know we can't go back, she said quickly. I know too much has happened, too much damage has been done. But sitting here with you now, talking like this, it reminds me why I fell for you in the first place. Will's breath caught. In all their time together, neither of them had ever used the word love or talked explicitly about feelings. Their relationship had existed in a space of unspoken understanding, of glances and touches and conversations that meant more than their words suggested. You fell for me? Of course I did. Her voice was so quiet, he had to strain to hear it over the hum of the machines. How could I not? You were brilliant and kind, and you listened to me like what I had to say actually mattered. You treated me like I was worth something. You are worth something. You're worth everything. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning and possibility. Maggie looked at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for months, and Will felt something crack open in his chest. Are we crazy for even talking about this? She asked. After everything that's happened, after all the hurt and anger and months of silence? Probably. Will shifted in his chair, leaning closer to her. But I've spent 6 months being practical and reasonable and doing what made sense. And it got me exactly nowhere. Maybe it's time to be crazy. Maggie laughed, and the sound was like music in the sterile space of the laundromat. Crazy like sitting in a 24-hour laundromat at 3 a.m. talking about feelings with the man who ruined my life? Crazy like that, yes. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his hand. The contact sent electricity up both their arms, just like it always had. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of hoping. Of letting myself believe that this could be real again. Of trusting you with my heart when the last time I did that, it nearly destroyed me. Will turned his hand palm up, letting her fingers rest against his. I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of walking away from you again. I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough to try. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, two people who had lost everything were beginning to find their way back to each other, one careful word at a time. The warmth between them was shattered by the sharp ring of Will's phone at 4:17 a.m. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. I have to take this, he said, standing abruptly and walking toward the front of the laundromat. Maggie watched him answer the call, noting how his posture immediately shifted into business mode. His voice was too low for her to make out the words, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he ran his free hand through his hair in frustration. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. When Will finally returned to where she sat, his expression was grim. What's wrong? She asked. That was my assistant. There's been a development with the Patterson acquisition. The deal I've been working on since. He paused, realizing what he was about to say. Since losing the Brennan merger. Since losing her. Since when? Since everything fell apart 6 months ago. Will sat back down, but he didn't meet her eyes. Patterson Industries is pulling out. They're concerned about some rumors that have surfaced about my personal life, my judgment, my ability to keep private matters from affecting business decisions. Maggie felt ice form in her stomach. What kind of rumors? The kind that destroy multimillion-dollar deals. Will's voice was flat, professional. Apparently, someone has been making calls, spreading stories about my relationship with my former housekeeper. About how I let personal entanglements cloud my business judgment. The words hit Maggie like physical blows. Former housekeeper. Personal entanglements. The clinical language reduced everything they'd shared to something sordid and shameful. Who would do that? I don't know. Could be anyone. A competitor who wants to see me fail. Someone who was involved in the original photographs. Will finally looked at her, and she could see the walls going back up behind his eyes. It doesn't matter who. What matters is that it's happening again. What's happening again? This. He gestured between them. Us. Me having to choose between my business and... He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Between your business and me, Maggie finished quietly. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? She stood up, the warm towels falling to the floor around her feet. Isn't that exactly what you meant? Here we are, 6 months later, and once again your connection to me is threatening your precious deals. Maggie, please. Let me handle this. Let me figure out who's behind these rumors and stop them. And then what? We pretend this never happened? We go back to our separate lives and hope no one notices that the billionaire spent a night in a laundromat with his homeless ex-housekeeper. The cruel summary of their situation hung in the air like poison. Will winced as if she'd slapped him. It's not like that. Then what is it like, Will? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like history repeating itself. The moment your association with me becomes inconvenient, you start calculating how to cut me loose. I'm not cutting you loose. No. Then what are you doing? Are you going to tell Patterson Industries that you don't care about their concerns? Are you going to choose me over the deal this time? The question hung between them like a challenge. Will opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The silence stretched on, and with each passing second, Maggie felt her heart break a little more. You can't do it, she said finally. Even now, even after everything you've told me about regret and empty houses and missing me, you still can't choose me over your business. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. Her voice was getting louder, and the laundromat owner stirred at his post but didn't wake. It's the simplest thing in the world. You either care about me enough to fight for us, or you don't. Of course I care about you. But this deal represents jobs for 300 people. It represents the future of my company. I can't just throw it away because someone is spreading gossip. Gossip. Maggie repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Is that what our relationship is to you? Gossip. You know that's not what I meant. Do I? Because right now, listening to you talk about damage control and protecting deals, you sound exactly like you did 6 months ago. Like I'm a problem to be managed rather than a person you claim to care about. Will stood up, his own frustration finally showing. What do you want me to do, Maggie? Walk away from everything I've built? Destroy my company and put hundreds of people out of work just to prove a point? I want you to fight for me. The words exploded from her, months of hurt and anger finally finding their voice. I want you to tell whoever is spreading these rumors to go to hell. I want you to choose love over money for once in your life. I want you to be the man I thought you were when I fell for you. And I want you to understand that the world doesn't work that way. Will's voice matched hers now, their argument echoing off the tile walls. I want you to understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, that sometimes we can't have everything we want just because we want it. Adults. Maggie's laugh was sharp, dangerous. You mean adults like me, who ended up homeless because of the difficult choices you made the last time? Adults like me, who have been sleeping on park benches while you've been in your heated mansion feeling sorry for yourself. That's not fair. Fair. She stepped closer to him, her green eyes blazing. You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when your security team threatened to destroy me if I ever mentioned your name? Was it fair when I lost my job and my apartment and my entire life because someone took pictures of us together? Was it fair when I spent Christmas Eve eating garbage behind a restaurant because I couldn't afford food? Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Will stepped back, his face going pale. I didn't know things had gotten that bad for you. Because you didn't want to know. Because it was easier to tell yourself that I was fine, that your noble sacrifice had protected me, than to actually find out what your protection had cost me. I tried to find you. You tried when it was convenient. You tried when your guilt got too heavy to carry. But you didn't try hard enough, and we both know it." Maggie was crying now, tears of rage and hurt streaming down her face. "If you'd really wanted to find me, you would have. You have resources, connections, private investigators. You could have found me if I'd mattered enough. You do matter." "No, I don't. Not enough. Not more than your deals and your reputation and your carefully controlled life." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And you know what the really pathetic part is? I almost believed you tonight. I almost let myself think that maybe you'd changed, that maybe you'd learned something from losing everything 6 months ago." "I have learned something." "Have you?" "Because it seems to me like you're about to make the exact same choice you made before. The safe choice. The profitable choice. The choice that protects your business and throws me away." Will was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "What if I told you I could handle this differently? What if I could find a way to save the deal and still..." "Still what? Still see me in secret? Still keep me as your dirty little secret while you build your empire?" Maggie shook her head. "I won't do it, Will. I won't be hidden away like something shameful while you live your public life." "That's not what I'm suggesting." "Then what are you suggesting?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Maggie thought he might actually fight for them. She thought he might choose her, might choose love, might choose the messy, complicated, risky reality of a relationship that didn't fit neatly into his controlled world. Instead, he pulled out his phone. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Try to contain this before it gets worse." And with those words, Maggie felt the last fragile hope in her heart shatter into pieces. Once again, when faced with a choice between love and business, William Hartwell had chosen business. The pattern was set. The decision was made. She was alone again. Maggie watched Will walk to the far corner of the laundromat, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to someone about damage control and crisis management. The distance between them felt like an ocean. She sank back into the plastic chair, pulling one of the cooling towels around her shoulders. The warmth that had returned to her body was fading, replaced by a different kind of cold. This one came from the inside, settling in her chest like a stone. How many times can one person break the same heart? She wondered. For 45 minutes, she sat alone while Will made call after call. His assistant. His legal team. Someone he referred to as the crisis management specialist. Each conversation was conducted in the same controlled, professional tone she remembered from his business meetings. The tone that meant emotions were secondary to strategy. The laundromat owner had woken up and was pretending to sort inventory while obviously listening to the drama unfolding in his establishment. Maggie caught his eye and tried to smile, but she could tell from his expression that her face showed exactly how she felt. Broken. Again. When Will finally finished his calls and returned to where she sat, his expression was unreadable. The vulnerable man who had shared his regrets and fears with her seemed to have disappeared, replaced by the billionaire businessman she'd first met 3 years ago. "I think I've got it contained," he said, sitting across from her. "My team is reaching out to Patterson's people, explaining that the rumors are baseless, that there's no current personal situation that would affect my business judgment." "No current personal situation," Maggie repeated slowly. "Is that what I am?" "Maggie, please. I'm trying to protect both of us here. By denying that I exist, by keeping your name out of it, by making sure you don't get dragged into another media circus." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How considerate of you, protecting me again by erasing me from your life. Just like last time." "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" "Because I've been sitting here for the past hour watching you choose your business over me for the second time in 6 months. I've been watching you prove that nothing has really changed, that all those pretty words about regret and missing me were just guilt talking." Will leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. What do you want me to do? Tell Patterson Industries that yes, I was involved with my housekeeper, and yes, I'm planning to be involved with her again? Watch them walk away from a deal that will save my company. I want you to stop thinking of me as your housekeeper. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. I was never just your housekeeper, Will. I was the woman who listened to your fears at 3 a.m. I was the woman who held you when you cried about your father. I was the woman you made love to and whispered promises to. But you keep reducing me to a job title because it's easier than acknowledging what we really meant to each other. The accuracy of her words hit Will like a physical blow. She was right. Even in his own mind, he'd been compartmentalizing their relationship, making it smaller and more manageable than it had actually been. You're right, he said quietly. You were never just my housekeeper. Then stop treating me like one. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, the wind less ferocious, the snow falling in smaller, gentler flakes. The roads will be clear soon, Maggie said, looking toward the windows. A few more hours and we can both go back to our real lives. What's your real life, Maggie? Where will you go when the sun comes up? The question was asked gently, but it cut deep. Where would she go? Back to the park bench, if it wasn't buried under snow? To another shelter waiting list? To another day of searching for food and warmth and a safe place to sleep? I'll figure something out. I always do. Come home with me. The words were spoken so quietly she almost didn't hear them. When she looked at him, she saw something different in his expression. The businessman was gone, replaced by the man she'd fallen for 3 years ago. What? Come home with me. Not as my housekeeper. Not as a charity case. Come home with me because I can't bear the thought of you going back out there, back to sleeping on benches and digging through garbage for food. For how long? Until the next business crisis? Until someone else takes pictures of us together and threatens your reputation. Will was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I know I can't let you walk back into that storm, literally or figuratively. Pity, Maggie said flatly. You're offering me a place to stay out of pity. No. Will reached across the space between them, his fingers brushing against hers. I'm offering because the thought of living without you for another 6 months, another 6 days, is unbearable. I'm offering because I'd rather risk everything than lose you again. Even your precious Patterson deal? Will was silent for so long that Maggie thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the hum of the washing machines. I've been thinking about what you said. About choosing love over money. About fighting for you. He looked up, meeting her eyes. You're right. I am going to lose the Patterson deal. Not because of rumors or gossip, but because I'm going to withdraw from the acquisition. Maggie felt her breath catch. What? I'm going to call them in the morning and tell them I've decided not to pursue the deal. That I have other priorities. Will, you can't do that. You said it yourself. 300 jobs depend on that acquisition. 300 jobs will be fine. Patterson will find another buyer, probably someone better suited to the acquisition than I am anyway. Will's voice was gaining strength, certainty. But there's only one you, Maggie. Only one chance for us to get this right. She stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing. You'd really do that? You'd walk away from a multi-million-dollar deal. I'd walk away from a billion-dollar deal if it meant having you in my life. But 6 months ago... 6 months ago, I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing everything I'd built that I lost the only thing that actually mattered. Will moved from his chair to kneel in front of hers, taking her hands in his. I won't make that mistake again. Maggie felt tears welling up in her eyes, But this time they weren't tears of anger or hurt. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you. I should have said it 6 months ago. I should have said it the first time I realized it was true, but I'm saying it now." His voice was steady, sure. "I love you, Margaret O'Connor. I love your laugh and your stubbornness and the way you hum when you think no one is listening. I love how you make me feel like I'm more than just a bank account and a business empire." "Will." "I'm saying that if you'll have me, if you'll give us another chance, I want to build a life with you. Not in secret, not hidden away from the world, but openly. Proudly. I want to introduce you as the woman I love, not as my employee or my associate or any other sanitized term. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious and terrifying in their honesty. Maggie looked into his gray eyes and saw no calculation, no hedging, no business strategy. Just love, raw and vulnerable and real. "And if someone takes pictures of us? If there's another scandal? Then we'll face it together. No more protecting you from consequences by making decisions for you. No more sacrificing our relationship to save my reputation. We'll be partners in whatever comes." Maggie felt something shift inside her chest, the ice that had been there for months finally beginning to melt. This was the choice she'd been waiting for. Not just words, but action. Not just promises, but sacrifice. The question now was whether she was brave enough to trust him with her heart one more time. The first rays of dawn were painting the laundromat windows gold when Maggie finally answered. "I'm terrified," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "I'm absolutely terrified of trusting you again. I know. If you hurt me again, if you choose business over me again, it will destroy me completely. I barely survived losing you the first time. I won't survive it twice." Will brought her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I won't hurt you again. I swear on my life, Maggie, I won't hurt you again." She studied his face in the growing light, searching for any trace of the calculating businessman who had made phone calls about damage control just hours earlier. What she found instead was the man who had held her during thunderstorms, who had read poetry to her on Sunday mornings, who had looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. Okay, I'll come home with you. Okay, I'll give us another chance. Okay, I'll trust you with my heart one more time." Tears were streaming down her face now, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. "But I have conditions." Will smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all night. "Name them." "No more making decisions about my life without me. No more protecting me from things I can handle myself. If we're going to be partners, we're going to be actual partners." "Agreed. And I want to work, not as your housekeeper, but at something that's mine. Something that gives me independence and purpose." "What kind of work?" Maggie was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I used to paint, before life got in the way. I was good at it, or at least I thought I was. I'd like to try again. I'll convert the sunroom into a studio for you. North-facing windows, perfect light." "Will." "What?" "I love you too." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. "I never stopped loving you, even when I hated you. Even when I was sleeping on park benches and cursing your name. I never stopped." Will stood up and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She was so small, so fragile after months of malnutrition and stress, but her spirit was as fierce as ever. "I'm going to take care of you," he murmured into her hair. "We're going to take care of each other," she corrected. The laundromat owner, who had been pretending to organize detergent bottles for the past hour, finally approached them with a shy smile. "Storm is over," he said, gesturing toward the windows where pale sunlight was filtering through the dissipating clouds. "Roads should be clear soon." "Thank you," Will said, pulling out his wallet. "For everything. for the warmth, for the towels, for giving us a safe place to weather the storm." The man waved away the offered money. "No charge for love," he said simply. "Love is free." Outside, Chicago was waking up to a city transformed by snow. The harsh edges of buildings were softened by white drifts, and the morning light turned everything into a winter wonderland. Street crews were already out, clearing the main roads, and early commuters were beginning to emerge from their buildings. Will's phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, his driver, his security team, all wanting to know where he was, whether he was safe, what his plans were for the Patterson situation. "I should call them back," he said, looking at the screen. "The Patterson deal?" "Among other things." Will looked at her seriously. "Are you sure you're okay with me walking away from it? It's a lot of money, and I know how much you value financial security after everything you've been through." Maggie considered this. 6 months ago, she would have told him to take the deal, would have insisted that financial stability was more important than romantic ideals. But 6 months of having nothing had taught her something valuable about what really mattered. "Money can be earned again," she said. "Trust, once broken twice over, might be impossible to rebuild a third time." Will nodded and dialed his assistant's number. "Rebecca? Yes, I'm fine. Yes, I know about the Patterson situation. I want you to call their offices at 9 a.m. and tell them I'm withdrawing from the acquisition. Personal reasons." He paused, listening to her protests. "I don't care about the financial implications. I don't care about what the board will say. Sometimes there are more important things than business deals." When he hung up, Maggie was staring at him with wonder. "You really did it. I really did it. No second thoughts? No regrets?" "The only regret I have is that it took me 6 months to realize what should have been obvious from the beginning." Will cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the last of her tears. "You are worth more than any deal, any amount of money, any business empire. You are worth everything." They stood there in the growing morning light, holding each other in the middle of a 24-hour laundromat, surrounded by the smell of detergent and the hum of washing machines. It wasn't romantic in any conventional sense, but it was perfect in every way that mattered. "So what happens now?" Maggie asked. "Now we go home. We get you warm and fed and safe. We figure out the rest as we go along. And if there are more scandals, more people trying to use our relationship against you." Will smiled, and this time there was no hesitation in his expression. "Then we'll face them together. Partners, remember." As they prepared to leave the laundromat, Maggie caught sight of herself in the reflection of the window. Her hair was tangled, her clothes were wrinkled and stained, and she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been living on the streets for months. "I look terrible," she said. "You look beautiful. I look like a homeless person. You look like the woman I love." Will's voice was firm, certain. "And I'm proud to walk out of here with you, exactly as you are." The simple acceptance in his words broke something open in Maggie's chest. For months, she'd felt invisible, worthless, like someone society had decided didn't matter. But in Will's eyes, she saw herself reflected as precious, valuable, worthy of love and respect. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. For really seeing me, not just the circumstances I'm in." They walked out of the laundromat together into the bright December morning. The snow crunched under their feet, and the air was sharp and clean in their lungs. Will's car was buried under a drift, but he called his driver, who arrived within 20 minutes with a warm car and no questions asked. As they drove through the snow-covered streets of Chicago toward Will's house in Kenwood, Maggie watched the city wake up. People were emerging from buildings, children were building snowmen in parks, and life was returning to normal after the storm. "Will," she said as they turned onto his street. "Yeah. When I was sitting on that park bench last night, when I first saw you walking toward me, do you know what I thought?" "What?" "I thought you looked like an angel." Which was ridiculous, because I was angry at you and hurt and convinced that you'd ruined my life on purpose. But in that moment, seeing you appear out of the snow, you looked like salvation. Will reached over and took her hand. You saved me too, you know. I was dying inside that house, dying in my perfect, controlled, empty life. Seeing you reminded me what it felt like to be alive. As they pulled into his driveway, Maggie felt a flutter of nervousness. The last time she'd been in this house, she'd left in tears and heartbreak. Now she was returning as his equal, his partner, his love. Ready? Will asked, squeezing her hand. Maggie looked at the house where she'd first learned to love and first learned to have her heart broken. Where she'd discovered joy and lost everything. Where she was now being offered a chance to build something new and beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Ready, she said. And as they walked up the front steps together, hand in hand, the morning sun broke through the clouds completely, turning the snow-covered world into something magical and full of infinite possibility. 6 months after losing each other, they had found their way home. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.